The officer at the gate. For 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days, the weapons moved freely. Not through tunnels, not through gaps in fencing, not through the remote desert crossings that federal border security architecture had been designed and funded to detect and close. They moved through the front door, through a designated commercial vehicle lane at one of the busiest ports of entry on the southwestern border, waved through by a federal officer in a federal uniform standing in a federal inspection booth, executing the exact authority the United States government had granted him to protect the border he was paid to betray. The lane was designated Lane 7. The officer who controlled it on the early morning shift, 5 days a week, for 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days, had a federal badge, a federal salary, a federal pension accruing with every shift, and a second income that federal investigators would ultimately document at $1.4 million in cartel payments deposited across 19 accounts in 3 countries over the course of the arrangement. During that time, Lane 7 became a reliable commercial artery for one of the most significant weapons trafficking corridors ever documented on the US-Mexico border. The weapons moved south, not north. Firearms purchased legally in the United States, diverted through a straw purchasing network operating across 4 southwestern states, funneled to a cartel logistics cell, packed into modified commercial freight, and cleared through Lane 7 by a man who had sworn an oath to stop exactly this. When federal investigators finally closed the case, the accounting was staggering. 1,847 firearms documented in the trafficking flow over the operational period. 41 commercial freight loads cleared through Lane 7 under the corrupt officer's direct facilitation. A cartel enforcement capability that had been measurably enhanced by U.S. origin weapons flowing through the corridor, with forensic traces connecting recovered weapons at violent crime scenes in 2 Mexican states back to specific firearms in the trafficking network's documented acquisition chain. This is ATF Trigger, and this is the case that took 4 separate federal agencies, 22 months of parallel investigation, and 1 critical piece of financial intelligence to break open, exposing not just a corrupt officer, but the entire architecture of the cartel's domestic weapons acquisition and export network that had been built around his corruption. The investigation began not at the border, but at a crime scene 400 miles away. Part 1. The trace that crossed the border twice. ATF special agents assigned to the Southwest Border Initiative ran crime gun traces as a standard function of their casework. Every firearm recovered at a violent crime scene in the region was submitted for tracing through the ATF's National Tracing Center, which could reconstruct the documented chain of commercial ownership from a weapon's original manufacturer through its last recorded point of retail sale. Traces didn't always yield actionable intelligence. Many guns had long ownership histories and multiple transfer points, but patterns across large volumes of trace data could reveal things that individual traces could not. The pattern that opened this investigation emerged from a batch analysis of 340 crime gun traces submitted from Mexican federal law enforcement partners over a 6-month period. The analysis was part of an ongoing cooperative effort under an existing bilateral law enforcement data sharing framework. Most of the traces in the batch resolved to retail purchase points distributed across the United States in a pattern consistent with general straw purchasing activity. No geographic concentration, no obvious network structure. Useful background data, but nothing that immediately generated an investigative lead. 12 of the 340 traces were different. Those 12 firearms had all been purchased at retail locations in a 4-state area within an 18-month window. They had all passed through the same documented intermediate point, a private party transfer, legally documented under state law, before disappearing from the traceable chain. They had all been recovered at violent crime scenes in the same 2-state area of Mexico within a 15-month window following their disappearance from U.S. law records. The intermediate transfer point was a single individual operating out of a residential address in a mid-sized city 200 miles from the border. He had conducted 47 documented private party firearm transfers in the 18-month window covered by the trace data, a volume that was not illegal, but was far above the statistical norm for individual transfer activity, and had not generated a federal flag because each individual transaction was within legal parameters. ATF opened an investigation. The individual was placed under surveillance. Within 6 weeks, investigators had documented him meeting with 3 individuals who were subsequently identified through law enforcement database queries as having prior federal contacts related to cartel-adjacent activity. The meetings involved the exchange of packaged materials, consistent in size and handling with firearms or firearm components, at a series of commercial locations, including 2 storage facilities and a freight staging yard on the outskirts of the city. The freight staging yard was the thread that connected the straw purchasing network to the border. Part 2. Lane 7 and the man who controlled it. Surveillance of the freight staging yard over 8 weeks documented a consistent pattern. Vehicles arrived carrying materials consistent with concealed firearms, spent varying amounts of time at the facility, and then departed in 2 directions. Some vehicles returned into the city, others traveled south, toward the border, toward the commercial freight lanes, toward the ports of entry where thousands of vehicles crossed every day under the supervision of U.S. SOL, Customs, and Border Protection officers. Federal investigators, working within the joint task force that had been formally constituted by week 10 of the investigation, requested CBP cooperation in identifying whether any of the vehicles tracked from the freight staging yard appeared in port of entry crossing records. The request was sensitive. It was made at a level above the port of entry itself, directly to the CBP's Internal Affairs Division, specifically because the task force had not yet ruled out the possibility of insider involvement at the border. That caution proved to be the most consequential decision of the entire investigation. The Crossing Records Review identified 4 of the surveilled vehicles in the commercial lane records for a single port of entry over the previous 4 months. All 4 crossings had occurred on the same shift. All 4 had been processed through the same lane. All 4 had been cleared by the same officer. The task force requested the officer's full crossing record for the previous 24 months. The pattern that emerged from that record was unlike anything the CBP Internal Affairs Division's analytical team had documented in a corruption investigation of this type. During the officer's assigned early morning shift on Lane 7, the secondary inspection referral rate for commercial vehicles, the rate at which vehicles were flagged for additional screening beyond standard primary inspection, was 2.3%. The port-wide average for commercial vehicles on comparable shifts during the same period was 14.7%. The officer's referral rate was not just below average. It was statistically impossible to explain as a product of normal inspection variance. The officer had processed 841 commercial vehicle crossings during the period covered by the analysis. If his referral rate had matched the port-wide average, approximately 124 of those vehicles would have been directed to secondary inspection. Instead, 19 had been. The gap: 105 commercial vehicles that crossed through Lane 7 on the early morning shift without receiving secondary inspection, that statistical probability indicated they should have received, represented the operational window that the cartel's logistics cell had been using. Not all 105 were weapons loads. The cartel's use of the corridor was more selective than that. They ran legitimate cargo through Lane 7 as well, maintaining the traffic pattern that made the officers' processing activity look like normal commercial lane management rather than a systematic clearing operation. But the task force's analysis, cross-referenced against the freight staging yard surveillance records and the vehicles already connected to the straw purchasing network, identified a subset of crossings that fit the operational profile. 41 crossings over 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days. Each one in the task force's assessment. A weapons load cleared through Lane 7 by an officer receiving cartel payment for his cooperation. The investigation shifted. It was no longer primarily a weapons trafficking case. It was a federal corruption case with a weapons trafficking case inside it. And the distinction mattered because it changed the investigative tools available, the prosecution strategy required, and the secrecy protocols that had to be maintained to prevent the investigation from surfacing before it was complete. A parallel financial investigation was opened under separate court authorization, targeting the officer's personal financial accounts and any connected accounts that could be identified through the initial review. What the financial investigators found over the following 4 months was the documentation that turned a pattern analysis into a federal prosecution. Part 3. 19 accounts and $1.4 million. The corrupt officer's official compensation over the period of the investigation was documentable to the dollar. Federal employment records provided a complete picture of his salary, overtime, and benefits. His documented lifestyle, examined through the Financial Investigations review of property records, vehicle registrations, travel records, and consumer spending data accessible through court-authorized financial account review, did not match that income. Not even close. The gap between documented income and documented expenditure was not subtle. It was the kind of financial discrepancy that suggested either a significant inheritance, a successful secondary business, or a sustained external income source that had not been reported to the IRS, disclosed to his employing agency, or otherwise made visible through any official channel. The financial investigators traced the income backward. The methodology was painstaking and took 4 months to fully develop. The officer had not deposited cartel payments directly into his primary bank account. The payments had moved through a layered architecture. Cash payments converted to money orders at retail locations spread across 3 states, deposited into accounts held in the names of 2 family members and 3 fictitious entities, moved through a series of intermediate accounts before reaching positions that the officer could access. The accounts were spread across banking institutions in the United States, Mexico, and 1 Central American jurisdiction. 19 accounts, $1.4 million in documented payments over 38 months. The forensic accountants working with the task force were able to match payment timing against the crossing records from Lane 7 with sufficient specificity to establish that payments consistently followed, within days, the crossings that the task force had identified as potential weapons loads. The financial architecture was a confession in accounting form. By month 17 of the investigation, the task force had what it needed to arrest the officer. But the arrest of the officer was not the end of the investigation. It was the leverage point for the next phase, because the officer's corruption was not the origin of the network. It was an enabling mechanism inside a larger structure that still needed to be fully mapped and dismantled. The task force made the decision to extend the investigation for 5 additional months, using court-authorized monitoring of the officer's communications, established without his knowledge, to map the cartel contacts who had managed his recruitment, maintained his cooperation, and coordinated the logistics of the weapons loads he was clearing. Those 5 months produced the connection to the cartel's domestic logistics cell leadership, and the connection to the domestic logistics cell leadership produced, through additional surveillance and court-authorized communications monitoring, the full picture of the straw purchasing network that fed weapons into the freight staging yard that fed Lane 7. At month 22, the task force had simultaneous warrant packages ready for execution across 7 locations in 4 states. The officer working his early morning shift on Lane 7 was arrested at 5:47 a.m. by federal agents who had been positioned at the port of entry since before his shift began. His arrest was the first of 22 that morning. Part 4, 22. Arrests, 7 locations, 4 states. The simultaneous execution of the warrant packages required coordination across ATF, FBI, HSI, and CBP's own Internal Affairs division. A combination of agencies that did not always work together easily, but had been operating as an integrated task force for nearly 2 years, and had developed the operational trust that made the simultaneous action possible. At the port of entry, the officer was taken into custody before he processed a single vehicle on his shift. His workstation, vehicle, personal property, and the Lane 7 inspection booth were all secured as evidence. Digital forensic teams began their review of the Lane's recording systems and the officer's work terminal within 30 minutes of the arrest. At the freight staging yard, 200 miles north, agents executed search and arrest warrants simultaneously at 5:47 a.m. 3 individuals connected to the cartel's domestic logistics cell were arrested at the facility. The facility itself was found to contain evidence of recent activity: freight packing materials, vehicle modification equipment consistent with the creation of concealed compartments, and documentation that included what appeared to be a scheduling manifest for upcoming freight runs. The manifest listed 3 additional loads scheduled for transport to the border in the following 11 days. All 3 were designated for Lane 7. At 4 residential locations across 3 states, agents arrested individuals connected to the straw purchasing network. The buyers who had acquired firearms legally at retail locations and transferred them into the trafficking flow. 2 of the 4 had prior contacts with law enforcement, but no prior federal convictions. The other 2 had no prior law enforcement contacts at all. They were, in the documented record, ordinary individuals who had been recruited into the purchasing network and compensated for transactions that each individual purchase made appear legal. At a financial management location, a small commercial office used by one of the entities through which cartel payments to the officer had been routed, agents seized financial records, electronic equipment, and physical documentation covering the payment architecture. The combined arrest and search operation was complete by 8:30 a.m. The evidence inventory that was compiled over the following weeks documented the full scope of what had been built and what had moved through it. 1,847 firearms in the documented trafficking flow over the operational period. Reconstructed through a combination of ATF trace analysis, the financial records connecting payments to specific crossings, and the forensic documentation of the straw purchasing network's transaction history. 41 confirmed weapons freight loads cleared through Lane 7 under the officer's direct facilitation. $1.4 million in documented corrupt payments to the officer across 19 accounts in 3 countries. Cartel-connected assets seized through forfeiture proceedings at the freight staging facility and connected locations. $2.3 million in vehicles, equipment, and financial instruments. The scheduling manifest recovered at the freight staging facility, the one listing 3 additional loads in the following 11 days, was perhaps the most viscerally understood piece of evidence in the entire case file. Those 3 loads had been scheduled because the cartel had no reason to believe Lane 7 was anything other than what it had been for 3 years. Open. They were not open. Not anymore. Part 5. What 3 years of an open gate produced. The closing phase of any investigation like this one requires an accounting, not just of what was seized and who was arrested, but of what the operation produced during the years it operated before it was discovered. For this case, that accounting was both a law enforcement exercise and a forensic reconstruction that took federal investigators and their Mexican law enforcement counterparts the better part of a year to complete. The 1,847 firearms that the investigation documented as having moved through the Lane 7 corridor over 38 months represented a significant enhancement to the cartel's enforcement capability in the 2 Mexican states where the weapons were primarily deployed. Mexican federal law enforcement partners, working with the ATF trace data from the investigation, were able to link weapons from the trafficking network to documented violent incidents, including homicides and armed confrontations, in the regions served by the cartel receiving the weapons. Specific weapons traced to specific incidents. That was the human cost rendered in the most concrete possible terms. The corrupt officer had not pulled a trigger. He had processed paperwork. He had waved through vehicles. He had collected his payments and managed his accounts and maintained the cover of a federal employee doing his job. The distance between those actions and the outcomes they enabled, the violence those weapons facilitated in communities across the border, was measurable in hundreds of miles. It was not measurable in terms of moral accountability. Federal prosecutors, in the charging documents filed against the officer, included a count-by-count accounting of the specific crossings that had been facilitated, the estimated weapons content of each load, and the documented downstream consequences of the trafficking flow, as established through the joint forensic reconstruction with Mexican law enforcement partners. It was one of the most detailed insider corruption charging documents the U.S. Attorney's Office had produced in a border corruption case. For the ATF investigators who had started this case with 12 crime gun traces in a batch of 340, the final accounting of the investigation was a demonstration of what the analytical approach to weapons trafficking enforcement could produce, starting from forensic data on recovered weapons and tracing backward through the commercial chain, across borders, into the corruption that had made the trafficking flow possible. The investigation had taken 22 months. It had involved 4 federal agencies operating in sustained coordination under strict operational secrecy. It had required financial forensic work of exceptional complexity. It had required the restraint to extend the investigation past the point at which the officer could have been arrested in order to map the full network structure that his corruption had enabled. All of that work converged at 5:47 a.m. when the officer arrived for his early morning shift at Lane 7 and found that the gate he had been selling was no longer his to open. ATF Trigger covers these cases because they represent the full scope of what federal weapons trafficking enforcement addresses. Not just the guns moving through illegal channels, but the human decisions and corrupt arrangements that create those channels. Lane 7 was open for 3 years, 2 months, and 11 days because one federal officer chose to sell his authority to a cartel that knew exactly what it was buying. It closed for good on the morning. 22 federal agents moved simultaneously across 4 states and documented every dollar of the arrangement in federal court records that will outlast everyone connected to it. 1,847 firearms, $1.4 million in payments, 3 years of an open gate, and the 3 loads that were scheduled but never moved. That is what ATF Trigger is here to document. The investigations that close the gates and the work it takes to find them. All information presented in this production is drawn from fictional dramatization of federal law enforcement concepts and documented investigative methodologies. No real cases, real individuals, or specific operations are depicted. ATF Trigger produces content for educational and informational purposes related to federal law enforcement procedures and capabilities. This production does not represent official communications from any federal agency.